Good morning. On behalf of my colleagues, faculty, and staff at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, I'm honored and delighted to welcome you to the 2012 Annual Symposium on the Arab Uprisings and the Future of Arab Politics. Since its establishment in 1975, the CCAS has been recognized as the most comprehensive university-based Arab Studies program in the United States. Its Master of Arts in Arab Studies program is distinguished by its rigorous Arabic language training and its multidisciplinary approach to the study of the Arab world from Morocco to the Gulf. Our public affairs program is an essential component of the Center's academic mission. We host or sponsor over 75 events each year, and this, our annual two-day international symposium, is the flagship event in our program. It is an opportunity for our faculty and students to convene with the foremost specialists on the Arab world and to enrich our mutual understanding of the region. In this spirit, over the years, the symposium has brought together scholars, policymakers, political leaders, activists, filmmakers, visual artists, authors, and musicians. And today it feels as if we may need all of them at once just to come to grips with the magnitude of the events over the events of the last 15 months, and which are the topic of this year's stimulating conference. And I thank each of our distinguished speakers for accepting our invitation to share their thoughts and insights on the Arab revolts. It's our pleasure to host such distinguished colleagues. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the extraordinary staff of the CCAS for their crucial and irreplaceable support in planning and arranging the conference, and especially our tireless public affairs coordinator, Marina Krikorian. I'm sure all of us can agree that we are in very good hands in this regard. Finally, I wish to thank my esteemed colleague, Professor of Arab Politics and Chair of the Symposium Committee, Samer Shahata, for his remarkable and, I have to say, very patient leadership in conceptualizing and organizing the symposium. Professor Shahata has been the driving force behind this excellent scholarly gathering, and so without further delay, I now cede the podium to him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Abi Mershid, for those welcoming words. As was said, my name is Samer Shahata, and I teach Arab and Middle East politics here at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, or CCAS. I am also the chair of this year's symposium. Every year, CCAS organizes a major academic conference on a topic related to Arab studies and relevant to Middle East specialists and scholars. The symposium is the annual highlight of the Center's academic activities. When Center faculty and staff met last summer to decide on a topic for this year's conference, the choice was obvious. The symposium had to take up the unprecedented protests, revolts, and revolutions that were taking place across the region, which began in December 2010 and January 2011. And so I am happy to welcome you to the 37th annual CCAS Symposium entitled "The People Want the Fall of the Regime, Ishab Yurid isqat nizam." The phrase, of course, has been the popular rallying cry, first in Tunisia, and then Egypt, Libya, Syria, and other countries affected by the Arab Spring. Over the last 15 months, millions of people in the Arab world have rallied to demand human dignity, social justice, and freedom, often in the face of violent repression. The initial catalyst for the events is well known. On December 17, 2010, a 26-year-old Tunisian fruit and vegetable street vendor set himself on fire in the town of Sidi Bouzid after he experienced police harassment because he didn't have a vendor's permit to sell his produce, his sole means of livelihood. Mohamed Bouazizi's produce, cart, and scales were confiscated, and when he tried to register a complaint with the local governor, he was poorly treated. Less than a month after Bouazizi's self-immolation, waves of protests across Tunisia swept Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali, president since 1987, for 23 years out of power. Less than 2 weeks after Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia, significant demonstrations were organized in Cairo. The events in Tunisia were inspirational for millions of people living under similar conditions in other Arab countries, people living under repressive regimes which denied them dignity and basic political freedoms. Many of these regimes also failed to deliver a modicum of economic well-being. Instead, Increasingly, youthful populations struggled to find employment in environments of corruption, crony capitalism, and shrinking government services. Beginning on January 25, 2011, thousands and then millions of Egyptians took to the streets to protest against the regime of Hosni Mubarak. The octogenarian president had been in power for more than 29 years, since 1981. After 18 days of sustained nationwide mobilization in the face of violent regime repression, Mubarak was forced out of office, with the help of the Egyptian military. Shortly after the first day of demonstrations in Egypt, major protests occurred in Yemen, and then Bahrain, and then Libya. Significant demonstrations had already occurred in Algeria, and in the weeks and months that followed, sizable protests spread to Jordan, Oman, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and Syria, where protests continue and are being met with brutal repression. No Arab state has been left untouched by the uprisings in one way or another. And the consequences have been enormous. For the first time, Arab leaders have been removed from power as a result of peaceful mobilization and popular protest. In addition to Ben Ali and Mubarak, two other ruling Arab autocrats have been deposed. Muammar Gaddafi, with the help of NATO intervention, who ruled Libya since 1969 for 42 years, and most recently, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had been in power in Yemen since 1978. For more than a decade, the central question in the study of Arab politics has been, arguably, the persistence of authoritarian regimes in the region. As such, the uprisings, rebellions, and revolts over the past 15 months raise a number of important academic questions about politics in the Arab world. Previously, scholars have asked how it was that Arab regimes remained remarkably durable, quote unquote, and why the region seemed impervious to democratization. Despite transitions from authoritarian rule in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, the Middle East, in the words of some scholars, was, quote, resistant to democracy and exceptional, unquote, in some ways. Panel 1 takes up this topic. What do the Arab revolts imply about the supposed stability of these regimes? Should the events of the last 15 months force scholars to reevaluate some of the assumptions about the strengths and vulnerabilities of these regimes? Is this durability illusory? And is the so-called exceptionalism of the Arab world, its ostensible inhospitability to democracy, a myth? Panel 2 addresses how best to understand the political transformations in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and other countries in the region, as well as the ideology behind the uprisings. Are the events that have taken place revolutions, with all that this term implies, or have the changes, in some cases, been less than fully transformative? A change of the occupants of power rather than regimes and institutions. And how should we understand the change that has taken place in Libya, where foreign military intervention played a critical role in determining the outcome? Much has been made of social media's role in the Arab Spring, with some describing the events as Facebook, Twitter, or even WikiLeaks revolutions, while others have attributed the success of the uprisings to the use of digital technology by internet-savvy youth activists. Panel 3 goes beyond the hype to seriously examine the role media and technology played in the protests. The panel also takes up an important socioeconomic dimension of the uprisings, namely the role of workers and labor protests in the Egyptian January 25 revolution, quote unquote, and whether Egypt's workers have benefited from the revolution. Arab militaries have clearly played a decisive role in both the trajectory and the ultimate outcome of many of the uprisings, yet the subject of civil-military relations has been relatively neglected in the study of Middle East politics for several decades. Panel 4 explores civil-military relations in the Arab uprisings. One of the key factors determining the course of the uprisings has been whether militaries and security forces more generally are willing to open fire on protesters to defend incumbent regimes. Why have different militaries behaved differently in states experiencing unrest? Why have some been willing to use massive violence against protesters while others have been reluctant to do so? This panel explores these and other related questions about civil-military relations in Tunisia, Egypt, and other countries in the region. Tomorrow, Friday, panels 5, 6, and 7 will explore specific aspects of the revolts and revolutions in Yemen, Syria, Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt, in addition to the role that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the Gulf Cooperation Council have played in different uprisings, at times resisting political change and at others supporting it. Finally, the last panel of the conference, panel 7, is meant to explore the state of politics after the revolution. That is, politics in countries that have experienced the fall of dictators, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. These are only a few of the questions that will be addressed over the next 2 days. I, like you, am eager to hear some of the answers that will be presented. However, no conference can be comprehensive, and there are certainly countries and issues that could have received greater attention. Bahrain, for example, or the economic dimensions of the uprisings and the extent to which these revolutions are, quote, revolutions against neoliberalism, as Walter Armbrust has described them. Nevertheless, this year's symposium is, in my opinion, one of the most comprehensive and impressive examinations of the Arab uprisings that has taken place so far. We have brought together leading scholars of the region who have traveled from Egypt, Lebanon, Morocco, Qatar, Germany, England, and different parts of the United States to be here. I thank all of the distinguished panelists for their participation. An event such as this requires an enormous amount of planning and work, and this year's symposium was no exception. A special thanks goes to Professor Osama Abi-Mirshid, CCAS Director, the Center's faculty and staff, and as has previously been said, especially Marina Krikorian, the Center's Public Affairs Coordinator, for helping make this conference possible. And once again, I would like to welcome all of you to the 37th Annual Center for Contemporary Arab Studies Symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Samer, for that really, I think, very useful introduction. You've described a range of topics and issues that I think really does constitute the most comprehensive and I expect interesting and insightful overview of the developments in the Arab world over the past year that we're likely to have the chance to participate in, and we're all grateful to the Center and to you for offering us this opportunity. I'm Steve Heidemann with the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'll be chairing this first panel on authoritarian politics in the Arab world, explaining regime durability, protest, and breakdown. We have 3 speakers on the panel this morning. Their bios are provided for you in full in the biography sheet that is available for you as you enter the auditorium, so I'm not going to introduce them at great length. They will speak in the order in which they're listed on the program. Each speaker will have about 20 minutes, after which I'll provide some very brief comments, and then we will turn to all of you to engage in a conversation with those of us up here.
Well, it's a pleasure to participate in this conference and to be in conversation with such an esteemed group of peers. During this presentation, I'm going to draw upon an article I wrote called Reconsidering the Robustness of Authoritarianism, Lessons of the Arab Spring. It just came out in the January edition of the journal Comparative Politics. So I'm not going to rehearse every point in that article. I'm going to hit the highlights. You can read it online. Any university that has a subscription to the journal should now be able to get it online. What I'm going to do in the next few minutes is focus solely on the major lessons and enduring questions about authoritarian durability and protest that I think we should glean from the events of the Arab Spring. And specifically, I think the events of the past year are significant to comparativists. And I should say I'm really speaking to comparativists here. I'm going to assume area knowledge since I'm at the premier center of area knowledge in the country on the Middle East. I think there are significant lessons for comparativists in four key ways. First, I think the events of the Arab Spring confirm some long-held truisms about what governs authoritarian regime survival. Second, I think the events spotlight an important new empirical reality that will govern the question of authoritarian resilience in the Middle East and beyond. Third, I think the events suggest some new theoretical puzzles, especially with regard to social mobilization, that I think will be fruitful to explore. And fourth, the events of the Arab Spring suggest the enduring utility of the extensive literature on the persistence of authoritarianism in the region. So that's what I will expound on for the next 15, 20 minutes. So first, let's focus on the theoretical truisms about authoritarian persistence that I believe the events of the Arab Spring have confirmed. All of us were taken by surprise by the events of the last year. Most of us were terrifically thrilled by the new political reality unfolding in the region. But I do believe the events of the Arab Spring ended up confirming some important truisms that many of us have long held about the factors that shape authoritarian regime survival. And to my mind, two of the most important truisms that were confirmed were this. First, the comportment of the coercive apparatus is pivotal to determining whether an authoritarian regime will survive or not. Whether the military is willing to shoot on civilian protesters or not is the most important factor that determines whether an authoritarian regime will be jettisoned or not. That's one truism. The second truism is the comportment of the military, that is, whether it will follow the rules from on high to shoot on civilians, is in turn shaped by two factors: the institutional character of the military, which I will explain, and the size, demographic profile, and violence of the citizens who are protesting. Now, both of these latter truisms have been developed at length by many scholars. I owe a great debt to Bob Springborg, who's written a terrific amount on the military in the Arab world, really shaped my thinking. There are new scholars, Holger Albrecht, who's working on this in inspiring new ways. I've explored this to some extent in an earlier piece I wrote called The Robustness of Authoritarianism in the Middle East that came out in 2004. What's surprising is how the events, I believe, how the events in the Arab Spring bore this analysis out. First of all, the events of the last year clearly bore out the view that the comportment of the coercive apparatus, that is, its varying will to repress, was paramount in determining the durability of authoritarian regimes in the region. In every Arab country where serious protest erupted, regime survival ultimately turned on one question: would the military shoot the protesters or not? And as we saw last year, where the military chose not to shoot, as in the cases of Egypt and Tunisia, the ruling autocrat had no choice but to flee. By contrast, where the military stood by the autocrat and proved willing to repress civilian demonstrators brutally, as in the case of Bahrain, the ruling autocrat survived. In cases where the military split, as in Libya, some refused to shoot, some were willing to fire on civilians, the result was civil war, and the fate of the ruling autocrat was ultimately decided by international intervention. And finally, in other countries, such as Syria, where the position of the military is unclear, regime survival clearly lies in whether the military will fragment, a la Libya, or whether it will manage to hold together and continue to repress, a la Bahrain. The point is, the events of the last year confirmed the truism that the comportment of the military is a key factor in shaping authoritarian regime survival. Now, what about the second truism? That variation in the military's will to shoot or not turns on the institutional character of the military and the size, demographic profile, and violence of the civilians protesting. Well, here again, the events of the Arab Spring confirm long-held truisms. With regard to the question of the institutional character of the military, what's issue is whether the military is organized, whether it's institutionalized in the Weberian sense, as opposed to being organized along patrimonial lines. Where the military is institutionalized, and by that I mean recruitment and promotion is based on performance rather than politics, there's a clear delineation between the public and the private that prohibits predatory behavior vis-a-vis society, where discipline is maintained through the inculcation of a service ethic and the strict enforcement of merit-based hierarchy rather than cronyism or balanced rivalry among primordial groups, where the military is institutionalized along these lines, these Weberian standards, The military will have a separate sense of corporate identity, a sense of identity separate from the regime. It will have a distinct mission and identity and career path. And under those conditions, the military will be able to imagine separation from the regime. In fact, the military may decide that its best interests are served by jettisoning the autocrat, if that autocrat is perceived as a national liability. Now, by contrast, where the military is organized along patrimonial lines, so where the military leaders are linked to regime elites through bonds of blood or sect or ethnicity, where career advancement is governed by cronyism and loyalty rather than merit, where the distinction between public and private is blurred, where economic corruption, cronyism, and predation is pervasive, in that situation, the fate and interests of the military leadership become intrinsically linked to the longevity of the regime. The military elite becomes deeply invested in regime survival. It perceives regime change as potentially ruinous, and under these conditions, the military leadership has significant reason to use lethal force against civilians in the name of defending regime survival. Now, the events of the Arab Spring bore this analysis out as well. In the case of Egypt and Tunisia, where the military was relatively institutionalized in the Weberian sense, the military refrained from shooting and sanctioned the ejection of the ruling autocrat. By contrast, in cases like Libya, Bahrain, and Syria, where the military was organized along patrimonial lines, the military did prove willing to shoot on civilians and enabled the dictator to survive. Now, in addition to the institutional character of the military, past analysis also suggests that variation in the size, demographic profile, and tactics of social mobilization are also key to determining whether the military will shoot or not. When the protesters are violent, the military may be less hesitant to shoot because the violence mobilizes the military's ethic to maintain order and security. Where the protesters are peaceful, the military will be more hesitant to shoot because shooting will then be perceived as massacre, not defensive order. Similarly, where the protesters are demographically similar to the military rank and file, the military elite will be more hesitant to order their subordinates to shoot for fear of eliciting mutiny and defection. By contrast, where the protesters are demographically different from the rank and file, the military will be less hesitant to order recruits to shoot because there will be less identification with the civilians and less danger of mutiny and defection. And this logic was also borne out by the events of the last year. The protesters in Egypt and Tunisia were demographically similar to the military. They were not differentiated by sect or language. They embraced largely peaceful tactics, and so the military hesitated to shoot. By contrast, the protesters in Bahrain and Syria were demographically different from the military, at least the elite, and they embraced largely peaceful tactics, and the peaceful issue is not an issue here, but the demographic difference is, and so the military, or at least significant portions of it, proved willing to shoot. Okay, so in these ways, the events of the last year have confirmed some key truisms about what shapes authoritarian survival. Now let me turn to my second point, that the events of the Arab Spring spotlight an important new empirical reality that will govern the question of authoritarian resilience from now on in the Middle East and beyond. The events of the last year highlight an empirical novelty for the Arab world, namely the phenomenon of huge, cross-class, popular protest in the name of political change. There's no question that it was an enormous surprise to see tens, if not hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens of diverse social origin joining in protest for political change in the Arab world. No one expected this, not foreign analysts and not the indigenous intelligence agencies. Now, what made this mass mobilization of protest possible? The confluence of many factors mobilized protest, but the only factor that was utterly new, and this we've all talked about at length, was the presence of new media, specifically the combination of social media and satellite television that made contentious collective action newly possible. It didn't compel it, but it facilitated it, even under the difficult constraints of authoritarian rule. And that was thanks to the media's ability to reduce transaction costs, nurture informational cascades, foster diffusion, and increase the cost of state repression by documenting the state's excesses and exposing them to an international audience. This is something that Mark Lynch has expounded to us brilliantly in the past year. Now, this new empirical reality proved pivotal to the Arab Spring and undoubtedly will be a game changer for the longevity of authoritarian regimes in the region from now on. Now to my third point. The events of the Arab Spring suggest new theoretical puzzles, especially concerning the dynamics of social mobilization that are of interest to comparativists. Most puzzling is the role that violent repression will or will not play in discouraging contentious action. There are leading scholars on this question. Mark Lichbach is one of them. He has long argued that repression can have contradictory impact on the mobilization of dissent. Sometimes state repression inflames protest by fueling popular outrage, but sometimes state repression successfully snuffs protest out by being so forceful and unrelenting. Lichbach has long argued that when regimes employ consistent and unyielding lethal force, protesters generally retreat. So what's puzzling then is the reality of the Syrian case. The fact that the regime's use of lethal force has not discouraged protesters from mobilizing, that the people continue to face down the regime's bullets, is utterly surprising to me, utterly puzzling. It begs for explanation. Also challenging is theorizing the motivation behind the protests. In my own work, I have teased out 4 factors that I believe were central to mobilizing protest in Egypt and Tunisia. I talk about the confluence of grievance and emotional triggers and impunity and the facilitation by social media. But then when I investigated subsequent cases of protest after Tunisia and Egypt, I found that none of these 4 factors proved either necessary nor sufficient in driving the later protests. And I have some thoughts about why this might be theoretically, but what's clear to me is a parsimonious, bulletproof explanation of the incidence of protest certainly eludes me, and that might prove an opportunity for others. Fourth and finally, the events of the Arab Spring make clear the enduring utility of the extensive literature on the persistence of authoritarianism in the Arab world. And this is evident for 2 reasons. First, not all of the Arab world was caught up in the wave of protests this past year. I mean, we certainly saw spurts of protest in almost every Arab country. But many countries escaped massive protests, regime-challenging protests at this time, including Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Jordan. The failure of protest to snowball in these countries is attributable to a variety of factors that has been made clear to us by this very rich literature on the persistence of authoritarianism. It includes the effective co-optation of the citizenry via regimes' generous distribution of buyouts in the case of Saudi Arabia. In Algeria, we attribute it to the societal exhaustion from prolonged civil war and the subsequent desire for calm. In Jordan and perhaps Morocco, we attribute it to the successful division and co-optation of opposition elites, topped off by the protective logic of monarchy. So these null cases constitute a silent spring in the Arab world, and there's no better place to begin to explain the incidence of these null cases except for looking at the persistence of authoritarianism literature. Now, to some, these explanations might seem like post hoc rationalization, but really, if you have deep knowledge of these cases, you have to begin with this sort of analysis, I believe. The second reason not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, the primary contribution of the persistence of authoritarianism literature has been to explain the puzzling survival of authoritarian regimes in the region for some that have lasted as long as 30 or 40 or even 70 years. The insights developed by this literature, spotlighting, for example, the paradoxical effects of partial liberalization, the peculiar protective logic of monarchical regimes, the effectiveness of divide and rule strategies at neutralizing oppositions. These insights are no less valid in 2012, just because 4 autocrats, out of some, 18 or 20 in the region, were jettisoned from power last year. So both the silent spring and the persistence of authoritarianism in the lion's share of Middle East and North African countries, to me, suggests the persistent utility of this literature. Let me conclude here. Again, I believe the events of the Arab Spring have confirmed many long-held truisms about the factors that spell authoritarians' endurance, and they do confirm the enduring utility of the persistence of authoritarianism literature. But the events also highlight new areas for fruitful research for comparativists and new empirical realities of great significance for authoritarian persistence in this region and beyond. Thank you.
The centrality of a strong security apparatus to the maintenance of authoritarian regime has been highlighted in the classic studies of single-party regimes, as well as in newer research of authoritarian resilience in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and we just heard part of that now. I would like to examine some fundamental questions related to the operation of state security in some authoritarian regimes such as Iraq, Egypt, and Syria, and to focus on a number of questions. One, how did state security collect information? Two, how was this information used? And three, did the information help these regimes in their durability? With regard to Iraq, we have now an excellent source, which is the archives of the security services, and for the first time we're able to construct how these agencies operated, how they recruited informants, and how they utilized the gathered information. We also have now partial documents from the Libyan secret services which add to our understanding. For the other two countries, Egypt and Syria, I mostly relied on published memoirs by heads and senior officers of the different agencies in those two countries. But before I turn to these questions, let me point the common denominators among those agencies in the different countries. I argue that there are more similarities than we think between these security services. First, in all these countries, security agencies were designed to overlap and were structured so as to ensure that no one agency would become strong enough to threaten the regime. Two, all countries had an average of 4 main agencies and a few others that were spin-offs or created for special purposes. Three, the pervasive and oppressive internal security apparatus is old and well established in all those countries. In Egypt, it began under Nasser and continued under Sadat and Mubarak. In both Syria and Iraq, oppression existed in the 50s and 60s, but the works of these agencies were developed and perfected under Hafez al-Assad and Saddam Hussein. With regard to the structure of these organizations, there were more even similarities between the agencies that existed in Iraq and those that operate in Syria. The heads of services in Iraq and Syria belonged to a few clans, while in Egypt they were diverse and many had long careers in the army before being appointed. But one word of caution regarding Syria. Everyone is currently talking as though all heads of security agency and almost all the security services were built around Alawites, not dissimilar from what we were told before the invasion of Iraq, that the security services were built around Sunnis and mostly Takritis. While that was partially true, we know now that Shias, Kurds, and Christians served in the Iraqi agencies at a high level to the end. In Syria, there are quite a number of senior officers in the intelligence community who are Sunnis. Interestingly, while a reliance on families and clans close to the regime was essential for the preservation of power in the Iraqi regime and probably in Syria, Sometimes it could be a double-edged sword, as once a particular clan was considered too powerful or dangerous, the authorities had to purge the system of all its members. And again, in the Iraqi archives still of certain clans that suddenly become unpopular with the leadership and the effort to uproot all these people in high positions. Another comparable aspect between Syria and Iraq is the role of the Ba'ath Party branches, who functioned as another layer of security by providing pertinent information given their knowledge of the localities. In Iraq, for instance, the role of the party branches was paramount in hunting down army deserters in small towns and villages, as they had better information than the city-oriented headquarters. Another comparable is the recruitment of officers to these agencies is more similar than has been thought. Emphasis on loyalty is paramount, and all put emphasis on the social origins of the candidate. Training of security officers was comparable throughout these countries. In a fascinating interview in one newspaper with a senior Egyptian security officers, he detailed the process of recruiting officers and their training, and admitted that all officers were trained in beatings, torture, and interrogation technique of suspects, which became a habit and, quote, a fact of life in these services rather than learning how to investigate the truth. In all those countries, but to varying degrees, families of suspects were utilized as a means to coerce the regime's enemies into submission. The next common denominator is the reason for joining these security services. In addition to the rewards and ability to extract bribes, the feeling of power is probably intoxicating. Given that these agencies were omnipresent, its members felt privileged and had almost an immunity that they enjoyed. Whether in Iraq, Syria, or Egypt, these agencies approved promotions and appointments within the government bureaucracy, judicial institutions, universities, and the army. Vetting everyone and vetoing any promotion led to a great sense of power and self-importance, exactly in the same manner that existed in the communist Europe during the 50s and 60s. From the government's point of view, hiring a huge number to join these agencies provided them with a sense of security and served as a means of providing employment to loyal supporters and co-opting others into the system. Corruption and abuse of power were natural outcomes of what I just described. Memos from the Iraqi archives indicate that the leadership was cognizant of the fact that officers were exploiting their positions to benefit or simply to use their affiliation as a tool of control and power. It should be also mentioned here that officers themselves in these security agencies were under the microscope for fear of changing their allegiance, and this led to severe punishments of many security officers, as the Iraqi archives indicate. Finally, personal conflicts and competition among the heads of different agencies in each country that I talked about played an important role in shaping the modus operandi of these services. The memoirs of Egyptian and Syrian senior officer give clear indication of the impact of this inner competition on the operation of these agencies. This, of course, makes it imperative for us to be careful with those writings, although they could be very illuminating about many topics. Having highlighted the resemblances between these organizations in the different countries, needless to say, there were many differences, as each country has its own circumstances and peculiarities. For instance, in Iraq, physical intimidation and torture was much more widespread than in Egypt and in Syria, at least until recently. Let me now turn to the three questions I presented in the beginning. The first is about gathering information, which was a formidable task. The transmission of information to the leadership was often imperfect because of its sheer volume. But it was sometimes deliberately inaccurate or embellished to hide inefficiencies or overstated promises made by the local leadership. So much information from many diverse sources flowed to the numerous security organizations that in many cases they admitted they were arresting and interrogating the wrong people. In one memo, the director of the Al-Amn in Iraq urged senior officers to be more thorough in their investigations before rushing to arrest innocent citizens. One head of the general security in Egypt, Fuad Allam, recounts in his memoirs how obsessive gathering and filing information had become, and admits that, and I quote, "If someone passed by me and simply said, 'Assalamu alaikum,' I would write a memo and file it. This is the correct method to safeguard our future." End of quote. Although these services gathered information, the thrust was on internal rather than external enemies. Poor intelligence contributed to Egypt's inability to win the war in Yemen, and in Iraq, military intelligence even lacked detailed maps of enemy territories. In all those regimes, informants played a critical role in the process of gathering information. We know now that in Iraq, very similar to communist Europe, the informants were not all hapless, illiterate, or coerced into providing information. A review of dozens of informants' files in Iraq clearly shows that they came from a broad range of socioeconomic strata and educational background. Many assume, in my opinion wrongly, that informants in the Arab world are only drivers, waiters, and doormen. The reality is that, similar to communist Europe, it is much more widespread. Some were obviously driven to inform in return for an approval or license to open a business. Some informed for malicious reasons against colleagues or neighbors, but many joined the ranks of informants to supplement their incomes. Needless to say, in any authoritarian regime, a large number was coerced to inform either during interrogation or after threats were made to them or members of their families. In such authoritarian regimes, there are always and will be always people who believe in these regimes' policies and hence provide information out of a conviction that they were doing the right thing. The role of informants in all these regimes were critical. In Iraq, we know that the regime even legislated a law to protect the informants and provide them with pension rights and compensation for their families in case of injury or death. They were everywhere and aided the Iraqi regime in solidifying the impression that it was ubiquitous. They gathered information not only about the enemies of the states, but collected rumors which are important in such regimes to gauge the public sentiment, gathered information related to the economy, such as the black market and illegal trading in hard currency. The main focus was obviously penetrating the ranks of enemy groups. These regimes saw in any group that did not accept their authority as an enemy. In Iraq, at one stage, security agencies were instructed to fight at least eight categories of enemies of the state: Kurds, communists, Islamists, ex-Baathists, and basically any organization that did not agree with the leadership. Enemies of the state changed in Egypt and Syria, obviously, throughout the last 4 decades. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood was a thorn for the security services from Nasser's days, and thus accessing information about the group was critical. Heads of Egyptian security claimed that they have managed to infiltrate the Muslim Brotherhood at every level through their informants. Allam tells the story that the security services knew of the attempt to assassinate Sadat 3 hours before it took place, as one of the senior Muslim brothers gave them all the details. This takes me to the second question. How was this information used? The gathered by the security services used? In this case I just mentioned, bureaucracy, inability to make decisions, fear of failure, lack of real commitment to the job, all combine to prevent the general security from utilizing this important information to save Sadat. Whether in Egypt or Iraq, the pyramid of power was such that officers were not willing to take risks by making decisions, and thus more repression was meted on the population, as there was no serious distinction between useful information and less pertinent ones. What is clear from the Iraqi archives and from some of these memoirs, that these agencies did have the information on almost every important subject. But the problem was the absence of swift interpretation and the appropriate channeling upward of this information, and finally, the decision-making process that hindered utilizing this information efficiently. Furthermore, the overlap of agencies that I mentioned before created entanglement and lack of clarity of information. This is not a new problem in these regimes. Back after the separation between Egypt and Syria in '61, all Egyptian intelligence agencies were scouring to get information about the new leadership in Syria without any coordination between them, and the result was that very little of this information became pertinent by the time it was presented to the Egyptian leadership. A critical concern facing authoritarian leaders is the credibility of information they gather, particularly during crisis. In Iraq, we know now that Saddam Hussein's inner circle did not disclose the truth to him about many situations and events, such as the invasion of Kuwait, the 1991 uprising, and prior to the 2003 invasion. Intelligence reports sent to the presidents were altered from their originals, as no one was willing to inform the president how the situation had truly deteriorated in certain strategic areas. A senior Syrian intelligence officer stationed in Cairo tells in his memoirs how Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amr totally misinformed Nasser on the first day of the '67 June War about the military situation. Of course, if the leader, as we witnessed in Iraq and other countries, was not open to challenging views, then the analysis of the information presented would be even weaker and less conducive for decisive judgments. This takes me to the last question. Was the information critical for the durability of these regimes? I think the overall answer has to be yes, but targeted repression may have been adequate for dealing with dissent in times of political stability, but it was incapable of neutralizing the opposition in times of instability when the size of the opposition rapidly expanded. This question leads to another one. These services in all those countries, and here I should add Libya, looked invincible for most of the decades they reigned, and yet could not prevent the toppling of the regimes. Many of these agencies, in my opinion, became ossified and incapable of dealing with the type of onslaught witnessed in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and now Syria. Political leadership was also paralyzed, and even when it received information, it could not act on it. The disarray that took place in all those countries is very much along the lines of what happened in communist Europe. I was just a few weeks ago in an exhibition in Berlin about the Stasi. There is a recorder of an informant who calls 5-6 days before the Berlin Wall collapsed to report about demonstration planned, and he finds out that there was no one in the agency to take the information, and even after finally managing to give it to someone, no one was willing to act on it. Documents published after the fall of Gaddafi's regime indicate the lack of serious intelligence received by the commanders loyal to Gaddafi leading to endless bickering and backstabbing by the different organizations. In one document, a senior Libyan official argued for adding more informants to its rank by forcing everyone on staff to spy and report on 20 neighboring families. None of the documents published by different newspapers from the Libyan files that were found addressed the possibility that the rebellion might have broader social support. Let me conclude by saying that researching and understanding the past of such regimes are critical for the future. The issue of reconciling with the past is still hovering over post-communist Europe, more than 20 years after the collapse of communism. Individual complicity with the security services in countries as Iraq, Libya, Egypt, Syria, and Tunisia will continue to haunt these countries for many years to come. With every dictatorship, a dark heritage comes, and when the dictatorship disappears, the people have to confront the past and resolve all the issues of guilt and responsibility. Thank you.
Well, let me thank all of our authors for having given us quite an extraordinary opening for our meeting. I think their work points out in many ways just how generative these uprisings have been for the production of some very creative, very innovative research, and I think all three of these papers are fabulous examples of that creativity and that innovation. Unfortunately, they've also given me far more than I'm going to be able to deal with in the short time that I have allocated to myself as a discussant, simply because I do want to make sure that we have an opportunity to engage with all of you before the session comes to a close. So I hope the authors will forgive me if I'm somewhat selective in aspects of these papers that I pick out for some further discussion. Let me take the papers in the orders in which they were presented and begin with Lisa, who makes the very interesting argument that low levels of participation in protests in some major urban areas like Damascus and Aleppo can be traced to the emergence, and I would say to the relatively recent emergence, of this ideology of neoliberalism, as she characterizes it, to an ideology that valorizes market-oriented forms of development, which she associates with distinctive techniques of governance, distinctive norms, distinctive reasons for compliance, and incentives for continuing to support a regime that emphasize sort of the pleasures of consumption, the lifestyle benefits associated with market-oriented reforms, and things like that. I found this, as I always find in Lisa's work, an extraordinarily interesting way of framing political dynamics in a particular context, but it did also raise a number of questions for me. First has to do with a fairly straightforward but not simple question of whether the presence of neoliberalism is necessary for the presence of neoliberal ideology. My own sense is that it would be a bit of a stretch to define Syria's political economy as neoliberal. I think the regime itself has gone to great lengths to try and mitigate its association with neoliberalism as a framework of economic development. It has identified its development strategy as a social market framework of economic policies and programs and so on, precisely to distinguish itself from more assertively neoliberal strategies of economic development. So if neoliberalism isn't present, or is present in ways that are a very direct expression of the peculiar pathologies of economic governance in Syria, how do we reconcile that with arguments about neoliberal ideology as a driver of political behavior among Syrians? Second, I also found myself wondering whether the arguments about neoliberalism might not simply be a different way of making the point that people act in pursuit of their material interests, that Syrians who have something to gain or to protect from the persistence of the regime are those who support it, and that those who find that there are opportunities for mobility, opportunities for employment, for education, may be constrained by the peculiar pathologies of Syria's political economy are the ones associated more closely with the uprising. And if that's the case, then we have an argument about how Syrians align in relation to the uprising, which is anchored in material interest, perhaps, and how we would connect that to your argument about the ideological drivers of behavior is something I think that's worth thinking about. One of the things that hampers our ability to answer questions about motivations behind decisions whether to participate in the uprising in Syria or not, of course, is the absence of any kind of detailed ethnography of the participants in the uprising. And what I found in Lisa's paper is that the supporters of the regime are characterized as a kind of social category which has a highly abstracted quality to it and makes it difficult for us to make connections between individual circumstances or even the circumstances of groups and other forms of social actors and their decision, again, about whether or not to participate. I'm not sure that we'll be able to really decisively answer questions about motivations, intentionality of who participates and who doesn't in Syria without that kind of ethnography. But I suspect that if we were to have one, we might find that it would lead us toward a much more complicated set of justifications for how Syrians position themselves in relation to the uprising than the paper seems to suggest. Yeah, turning to Eva's paper on reconsidering robustness, I will say just in general, I was struck by the extent to which all three of these papers on a panel about durability, protest, and breakdown focused far more on the durability side of the equation. I think the protest and breakdown side of the equation might have been neglected to some extent. We can take that up in the question and answer period. But I wanted to focus, Eva, on your second truism about the importance of whether the military identifies itself as a defender of the regime on one hand or a defender of the nation on the other. It seems to me that this may mean far more for assessing prospects for leadership transition, but may not tell us very much at the end of the day about the trajectories that follow a change at the top. How does a military's sense of its corporate identity tell us how it will conduct itself once a leadership change has occurred? And I think Egypt is a telling example of that. And what this suggests is that we need to know much more about militaries and much than their tolerance for change at the top, and much more about whether corporate identities really determine the performance and behavior of officers during an extended process in which they may find that democratic transitions threaten many of what they have come to view as their prerogatives. Second, one more thing for Eva before turning to Joseph. You talked about new empirical issues raised by the uprisings, and I think you're right. They've opened up tremendous opportunities for research. And the question of the emergence of these cross-class coalitions of protesters, you attributed those very heavily to social media. I think what you've raised, perhaps indirectly, is the question of triggers. What were the direct, immediate triggers of these mass protests? There's an active debate about the significance of social media in that regard. We've seen all kinds of statistics about the limited extent to which Egyptians had access to the internet. We've seen arguments about alternative sources of collective action in the Egyptian context. There are, for instance, the question of the blatantly fraudulent elections, parliamentary elections in November 2010, and the extent to which that pushed a number of Egyptians beyond some kind of tipping point. There's the question of the anticipation of an additional 40 years of Mubarak rule if Gamal were able to succeed in inserting himself as his father's successor. So there are multiple potential triggers at play in all of these uprisings. And I think we need to begin unpacking them and trying to come to more nuanced understandings about what they are and how they operate. And then finally, Joseph, I thought your paper was quite extraordinary in the level of detail it was able to develop about the inner workings of these security agencies and their relationships both to one another but also to society at large. And that led me to recognize that what you're really giving us, in a sense, although I don't think you develop it in quite this way, is a very clear sense of the consolidation of security regimes as institutionalized social orders, not simply the consolidation of networks of bureaucracies, but as something much, much broader, more profound, more deeply imbricated in these societies than your analysis actually said explicitly. Which leads me to ask, and this may in fact be an entirely different research project, but it would be interesting to hear you say something about it here, whether we can say something about the social dimensions of these orders, not just for insiders, but more broadly, how these dimensions, how these social orders structure state-society relations, and how these might complicate our understandings of durability and decisions to participate in protests of the kind that Lisa presented. What does it mean for citizens who operate in these institutionalized social orders of surveillance, repression, coercion, for understanding how people respond to opportunities to resist? I think I will leave it at that. And what we will do now, I think, is perhaps give each of our panelists just a couple of minutes to make some comments, perhaps based on these questions, and then we'll turn immediately to the floor. There are microphones, as you'll see, in each of the main aisles here, and I would ask those of you who have questions to move to the aisle where you'll be able to address your question to panelists or to the panel as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Those are fantastic questions, and I think you're right that there is a tendency in the paper to be more reductionist than I'm comfortable with, and particularly in using neoliberalism to telegraph a very complex situation. Let me just say 3 points and then leave it to my colleagues to respond as well. I agree that neoliberalism doesn't work in every place the same way, and in many ways the Syrian regime has been at great pains not to implement policies that are neoliberal in the extreme, and in fact my book on Yemen also goes to great pains to disaggregate the term, but I thought I was missing something important here, and I think it's actually underscored by the familiar refrain that I invoked in the paper about, you know, in the era of Hafez al-Assad, even he didn't have bananas in times of scarcity, that there is something that happened in the decade of the 2000s that perhaps I need to characterize in a different way, but that there's something that happened in the 2000s that meant not only did Bashar al-Assad have bananas, but that there was no longer a problem in having bananas, that something had changed in terms of people's value or orientation to what it meant to live with scarcity and what it meant to participate in a good life that did not require the same kind of redistributive commitments that at least were paid lip service under the 30 years prior. The second issue about material interests in the groups, articulating them, I am not making the argument that material interests don't matter. I'm suggesting that what counts as an interest is inflected by how we understand what interest is and how we go about acting in interested ways, and that understanding of interest cannot be disarticulated or divorced from a notion of ideology. I'm not actually interested in individual intentions, however. I'm interested in the work certain kinds of ideological mechanisms do. And by work, I mean two things. I mean the logic of, say, a discourse, that is to say, what's implied by it, what sort of assumptions undergird it, what kinds of ways are certain visions foreclosed by it, and its effects, the kinds of things it incites in public space. And so I'm not making a causal argument that says no, it's ideology that matters and material interests don't. I'm actually questioning the bifurcation, and let me give you a very concrete example of this. So I don't understand how one can talk about institutions outside of ideas. What does schooling mean outside of a notion of pedagogy? What does police or enforcement mean? What does policing mean outside of a notion of what counts as enforcement? So what I'm trying to do is unravel or unsettle a certain assumption that makes those two terms so seemingly logically incompatible, where you have to choose one versus the other. I do agree that one does need more ethnography. I am interested in the kinds of affective commitments, surplus pleasures, and particularly ambivalence that has surrounded folks who have remained, if not silent, certainly less than willing to go out into the streets and protest. And I do want to think about the kinds of economic incentives, or what is understood as incentive, in relationship also to the very powerful forms of risk that have to do with fear. Some of these protests have been cross-class, and of course there are wealthy people who are supporting the resistance without going into the streets. But I do want to be very clear here that I'm not making an argument that ideology drives everything, and that the notion of intention is extraordinarily vexed, and when people tell you what their intentions are, we don't necessarily know that they're the real intentions, because we, as psychoanalysis tells us, we don't really have access to all of our intentions anyway. So what I'm wanting to do is think more in, for lack of a better term, a kind of pro-structuralist way about the work these ideologies do independent of people's intentions. Thank you.
Let me respond to the issue of the relationship between a military having a professional corporate identity and authoritarianism. I do not intend to argue that as soon as a military has a professional corporate identity, it will not be a pillar of authoritarianism. That's not what I meant to argue. What I meant to argue is that when a military has a professional corporate identity, it can imagine an identity separate from the particular regime in power. And so it can imagine not obeying the order to shoot and jettisoning a leader like Mubarak or Ben Ali. Clearly, very corporate professional militaries have played central roles in politics and in authoritarian politics. I mean, this is something that a colleague of mine who's an expert in Latin America said to me as soon as she heard this version of the paper. She said, well, what about all those militaries in Latin America in the 70s? They were extremely professional and extremely meritocratic, and they were brutal and authoritarian, and that's absolutely true. I don't need to deny that. It is interesting that there has been a generational shift. I mean, we do not see militaries, corporate professionalized militaries, seizing the reins of power with the alacrity today that we saw 30 years ago. And that's because they've been persuaded through bad experience of peers that it can often be very bad for the military to be responsible for politics. But I don't mean to imply that corporate identity means no authoritarian military-led regimes. The second point about role of social media and what triggers cross-class protest, I mean, you're absolutely right. Social media alone can't explain anything. And in my own analysis, I mean, I identified a variety of factors that I think were very important in mobilizing the protests. Grievances of various sorts, emotional triggers, what I called impunity. Under the category of emotional triggers, I include things like very important things that you mentioned, like stolen elections in Egypt, concern about succession, outrage over the succession question in Egypt. What's interesting, though, is when I teased out what I thought was mobilizing protest in each country that I knew, I could tell a very nice explanatory story. But then when you turn around as a political scientist and try to distill that and come up with some parsimonious, again, bulletproof explanation that works consistently, it never worked. And, you know, it was a failure. Now I think this has something to do with the dilemma of prediction altogether in political science, that our ambitions are probably a little too great, but nonetheless, being able to tease out textured, detailed explanations for protest in any individual country does not necessarily give rise to a tight, generalizable argument about protest in general.
Thank you for your question. I think you raise a very important aspect, the social order and the social dimensions. And you're right, I really did not focus on that a lot, and neither in my book on Iraq, although I do say, for example, that there is incredible scope for social history and understanding the social dimensions, because every applicant file to these agencies and even and more importantly to the military academies has a file with their social origins. And because the regime in Iraq, much more than let's say in Syria or Egypt, put emphasis on the family, it used to investigate up to the 5th degree of relatives, which is incredible in these large families. I think that the implications are very important both for the durability of the regime, but also for post-authoritarianism. I think for the durability of the regime, it definitely played a role in the sense of making more people vested in the system. And for post-authoritarian regimes, I would argue that it's going to create a lot of complications, as it implicate far more people than just the small percentage of people who operated in these agencies, as they were all beneficiaries. But I think there will have to be a lot of research on that.
There has been a mad dash for the microphones. Don't crowd, please. Don't crowd. Joel Boehnen, please.
Okay. So, prompted by Steve's very perceptive comments, I want to ask the panel as a whole, what is it that we're trying to understand? Are we trying to understand why Mohammed Bouazizi immolated himself on December 17th? Or are we trying to understand the very complex matrix of factors which converged on the Arab world in the aftermath of his self-immolation? And if it's the latter, then I would urge Lisa to continue to talk about neoliberalism with understanding that this is a complex phenomenon with many different variations, both practical and ideological variations. And then I would suggest that there's another thing we want to talk about, which is the social movements that are preceded the events of December, January, February. For example, just one, in the Gafsa phosphate basin in Tunisia in 2008, exactly the same place where Sidi Bouzid is located, there was a 6-month-long uprising against the regime, which began with over the question of hiring in the phosphate company, but had multi-class aspects. It was supported by students and others in the coastal cities. It was supported by Moroccan emigres in France and in Canada. So had much of the same character of what happened in 2010, 2011. And it was repressed. And so second time around, it was not. So that's the sort of difference that I think is worth talking about as opposed to narrowing on the moment of what happened after Mohammed Bouazizi's self-immolation. And finally, directly to Lisa, you somewhat promiscuously intermingle discourse and ideology. And we can do that sort of as a shorthand or in non-professional language, but I think it might be worth discussing, do you mean discourse or do you mean ideology? And that in turn might help us understand why there isn't a coherent ideology that lies behind the very variegated social movements that have overthrown the autocrats.
Thank you. What I think we'll do is take one more question from the other side, Kevan, and then give our panelists a chance to respond briefly and continue in that vein.
Right, I'll be brief too. Kevin Harris from Johns Hopkins. other than some of the issues that Professor Beaman brought up, such as the role of labor, I want to ask a process-based question on the outcomes, because if let's say we had a VCR and we rewound the tape back to the beginning, the first days of many of these protests, then pressed play, the same original conditions would have been present, or lack of, in all of these situations, and pressed play, would they have gone the same way? And the reason I ask is because kind of these process-based ways of looking at the moment itself, and so the role of labor, why labor at some point intervened in both the Tunisian case and the Egyptian case. I mean, and then in those cases the cameras were not on the general strike or the strikes in parts of key segments of the industry, but in both of those cases that seemed to be the moment that forced the military, however professional they were, to reconsider or to push things another way. So if we try to go for the parsimony, do we lack a real understanding of how process actually determines the outcome, perhaps as much as or more than original conditions?
Okay, thank you, and I'll just let the panelists decide how you want to engage.
I'll start. First, Joey's excellent questions. I don't want to give up on whatever that thing is I'm talking about that's telegraphed by the term neoliberalism, and I do think that it's extraordinarily important to think about the welfare state retrenchment, the privatization of assets previously public, and a certain kind of investment in the good life. I'm trying to explain why it is that Damascus and Aleppo didn't rise up, or that major populations in those major cities haven't risen up thus far. In that sense, I think Stephen's right, that there's a kind of maybe overemphasis in the politics of authoritarian reproduction as opposed to in protests, but most of my work has been on protests, or a large part of it has been on protests, and I myself was not particularly surprised by the events in Yemen. I was much more surprised by them going into Syria, because I think Yemen has had instances of major democratic practices and social movements, civil society organizations, a kind of remarkably vibrant political life in the absence of a democratic regime for a very long time. Syria is much different in that sense. With relationship to ideology versus discourse, I actually don't mean to conflate them. I'm really talking about ideology here. Discourses are instances or indications or symptoms of a broader ideological moment, of a broader ideological set of strategies. So I use discourses to get traction and analyze particular discourses to get traction on something more general than that. In relationship to outcomes, I'll just say very quickly, I mean, in the case of Syria, I have no idea what the outcome is going to be at this point. It looks like we're in a civil war, if we understand civil war in the ways that most social scientific definitions understand civil war. I don't think they're particularly good definitions, but they're helpful at least in terms of clarity. I would be very reluctant to say that we know about the outcomes in most of these cases yet. I mean, think about the French Revolution. It went on for 100 years. What was the outcome? Well, it may be too soon. I mean, it may be too soon. So if I'm talking at the French Revolution in 1789, I have a very different sense of what the outcome is than if I'm talking even in 1792. And 50 years later, it's a very different thing. So I think we have to be careful about our rush to talk about outcomes. I mean, we can talk about a temporary outcome, but I think it is very important for us also to realize that revolutions or social change take a tremendous amount of time.
I have to laugh. I think it was Zhou Enlai, was it he who said, when asked in the 60s or 70s, what do you think of the French Revolution? He said, it's too soon to tell. Yeah. Right? That was the line. I would just say to our colleague from Johns Hopkins, my answer is yes. I mean, yes, we need to focus more on how process comes into play, determines outcome.
Joseph?
Yeah, I mean, I think this issue of informants is really critical, both for, as I said, for during durability of the authoritarian regime and post-authoritarian, because this issue is how do you deal with these people? I mean, a lot of these people just supplemented their incomes by reporting on something. Sometimes it led to grave consequences, but a lot of other times it was really totally innocuous in order to supplement their income. And these issues, as I mentioned at the end, have not died in Europe, even more than 20 years. Just recently there was a long article about these Polish archives and Polish informants and how do you tackle it. And I think we need to understand more about how the whole society reacted under authoritarianism, but also post-authoritarianism. One of the things that I have always come to the conclusion from reading all this, that it's not that everyone was either with Saddam Hussein or against him. I think we tend to forget that there were a lot of people in the middle that were being, you know, played like a ball game. Either they go on this side or that side. And they ended up being the people who suffered under both circumstances, because they are suffering from all violence in general.
Thank you. We have 5 more minutes and 5 questions. I think we'll take 3 questions this time. Take all of them? Okay. In the spirit of democracy, we will respond to a request from the panel. State your questions, please. 6 questions. Oh my God, proliferating. Please.
His turn.
Hi. My name is...
Please identify yourself.
Yes. I'm Lin Zor. I'm a student here at CCAS. And I had a question about... You talked a lot about protests and authoritarian resilience. And I wanted to get at the question of reform and how reform is sometimes instrumentalized to sort of reinforce authoritarian regimes. And I had a question about the notion of the Damascus Spring. And, well, my question is, what are the, according to you, the institutional and structural characteristics that makes a regime difficult to sort of reform itself? We can talk about Syria, but other regimes as well. Thank you.
A very simple question. Okay.
Amin Mahmoud, Egyptian Association for Change. And my question to Eva, you put in your first point, the military who doesn't shoot on the people and change as it happened in Egypt. I will argue that CCAS is unclear what happened during the 18 days. We don't know exactly. And also they were involved on the Battle of Camel. They allowed it to happen under the military. And then after the revolution ended and the Mubarak stepped down, we see that they shoot on people in many cases. I would like to see you respond.
Thank you, sir.
My name is Matthew Anderson. I'm a student here at Georgetown. My question is for Dr. Sassoon. In your presentation, you focused mainly on the role of informants, as I understood it, in gathering intelligence. In my experience living in Egypt for a couple of years before the revolution, there was a great deal of anxiety about sophisticated forms of monitoring. In the case of tapping phones, tapping mobile phones, hacking email accounts, all this kind of thing. Is this something that was an unrealistic anxiety, that there was, there were these visions of kind of rooms where massive amounts of information was being processed and sifted from people's personal lives, or was that unrealistic, or was that something that these regimes were up to?
Thank you.
My name is Alex, and I'm at the Carnegie Endowment. I have just two questions. The first is for Lisa. It's about the question that Eva posed earlier. Why are there Syrians that are still willing to sacrifice their lives in the streets? If you could just talk about the other side a little bit. Is there, I know you're not trying to make a causal argument for ideology, but is there an ideology behind that? Is it some sort of, that they're the have-nots and they're willing to lose even more? Is there some sort of nihilism a Syrian nihilism that's appearing? And then the other comment, it's more of a comment, but for Professor Sassoon, I found it a little bit problematic at the end to say that intelligence is important in times of stability, or we see that it was a really critical, but in times of crisis, they were paralyzed. Because I think the point of these security services and intelligence services is to then predict and prevent periods of crisis. So I think it would be useful, could you talk a little bit more about what exactly the utility was that these intelligence services brought, and maybe could just expound a little bit on the utility that you saw, because I still am a little bit unclear. Maybe a specific example of why the intelligence services were useful.
Thank you. Sir, the final question for this session.
Yeah, thank you. Thomas Hiske, University of Bayreuth in Germany. One comment goes to Eva Bellin. I'm not so convinced about your distinction between different types of the military, particularly when it comes to Egypt. And I would say in Egypt, the military just uses another form of violence, but that is not less orchestrated and planned, and it is continuing. And we should take this into consideration in our discussion about the role of the Egyptian military. The other point goes to Joseph Sassoon. I think a very good starting point to debate about the imperfection of organizations and the need to deconstruct the myth that organizations, as particularly security organizations, are perfect or efficient. In many cases, they are not. The other point is the emerging culture now of allegation and potential vengeance that is coming up in countries like Libya, for instance. That is related also to lack of information of what secret services were actually capable and what not. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me alert the chairs of future panels that we have a very strategic audience in the House today. They arrive at the microphone with multiple questions. Let me now give our panelists, I'm afraid, 90 seconds each to respond.
Go ahead.
I humbly accept the criticism that I whitewashed the military in Egypt. That was not my intention, by the way. Clearly, SCAF has been violent in the years since the revolution, and there were incidents of violence during the revolution, but let's be honest, had the military decided to really use its tanks against the people, they could have steamrolled the protests as they have in other countries. So we have to distinguish between violence and willingness to shoot and how far you're willing to go. So that's important theoretically. In terms of the question, how is reform instrumentalized to reinforce authoritarianism? You got Steve Heidemann here, you have Dan Brumberg here, you have Holger Albrecht, who's written a whole book, edited a whole book in this. There's such great literature in this. I'm going to leave it to you. Since you're here at Georgetown, you have many resources to tap into, get into that very rich question.
The role of informants, you're absolutely right. I focused on that, but there are a lot of other sophisticated methods which in the Iraqi archives, it details it. Bugging devices were sold by East Germany back in the 70s to Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and other countries, and it's all documented. So yes, the answer is definitely there was a wide use of that. Of course, all these regimes want to make it even more ubiquitous in order to scare the population that in every room there is a microphone. With regard to the problem of utility of these intelligence services, I might have exaggerated the lack of utility in times of crisis, but it is, as the next questions talk about, is the imperfect of organizations. These become such huge organizations that it is really very difficult for them to be flexible and adapt to quick situations. In Iraq, the 1991 was a total failure, how to deal with the uprising. And I think part of it is, what happens as a result is that they end up meting out more repression and more violence to compensate for the lack of the analysis and the lack of efficiency of information. As for the last question, I agree with you. This issue of culture of allegation and vengeance has to be really addressed and dealt with because it is going to be with us for a long time, and given the turmoil that will exist in all those countries, this will just add to it.
Lisa.
Okay, and on the issue of reform, I do think that there are a number of authoritarian regimes that imagine that significant reforms may reform the regime out of existence, and anybody who thinks that isn't true would have the example of Gorbachev, who imagined relativizing the party, and in relativizing the party actually undermined the party's authority to rule. The question about why so many Syrians have stayed on the streets, I think that's changed over time. What keeps some people resilient and other people not. But the two main factors, I think, are one, now revenge, so that when one person dies, there are 10 people who are mourning that person in ways that are irrevocable for their own lives, and they want to get back. And armed resistance started in Daraa in April, or at least there are good indications that armed resistance started in some places early on. But in any case, I think revenge is one reason, and the second one is that there are many people now in the streets who are quite pious, where death isn't the end of life, and where there's pride in an honorable death such as this one. So I think both of those things are true.
Thank you all very much, and please join me in thanking our panelists for getting us off to such a good start.